The Galactic Conclave Chamber held 43 species under one roof, and every single one of them was certain they had already seen everything worth seeing in the known galaxy. The seats curved in wide rings around the central speaking floor, rising so high that the beings seated at the top looked like faint stars pressed against stone, and every one of those stars was watching when the human ambassador walked to the podium. Mara Voss was not tall, and she was not dressed in anything that demanded attention. She carried a single datapad, set it on the podium without ceremony, looked up at the room, and gave the 400 years of political history staring back at her exactly 12 seconds of silence. Then she began. The address ran 12 minutes, no raised voice, no pauses for effect. She laid the facts down in the order they had happened, the way a builder lays bricks, one after the other until the shape was unmistakable. The NIGMA Empire had expanded into the Kethra Belt. That expansion had destabilized 3 civilizations that had not yet reached the stars, 3 species with no seat in this chamber and no voice to speak for themselves. The resource corridor through the outer shear had been broken. And that breakage was costing human colony worlds in food and medicine and equipment and time. She named every number. She cited every source. She did not ask for sympathy. At the end of 12 minutes, she issued one demand. The NIGMA Empire would withdraw all operations from the Kethra Belt within 90 standard cycles. She picked up her datapad and walked back to seat 41. Seat 41 was in the back row. Humanity had held a conclave seat for 11 years, which in galactic terms was the rough equivalent of arriving at a centuries-old dinner party and suggesting the host rearrange the furniture. No voting rights, no formal allies, a seat and the right to speak, and Mara Voss had used both. Grand Consul Varric Nin of the NIGMA Empire rose to respond, and he was impressive when he rose, 8 limbs arranged in the traditional display of patient authority, bioluminescent skin moving through warm gold and amber. The colors his species used to signal the calm certainty of someone who has never needed to hurry. He looked at Mara Voss the way a mountain looks at weather. He spoke for 17 minutes. He noted with great warmth that humanity had held its conclave seat for 11 years. He noted that the NIGMA Empire had held its seat for 400. He described the Kethra expansion as a project of careful stewardship, of long-view thinking that younger species would come to understand and appreciate with time. He called Voss's address the natural enthusiasm of a civilization finding its early voice. The chamber laughed. It was a good laugh, the warm and comfortable kind that fills every corner of a room and leaves no space for anything else to exist inside it. 43 species, some ancient, some merely old, and all of them at ease. Seat 41 was quiet in the back row. Mara Voss wrote something on her datapad. Nobody asked what. Rixtala, junior attaché to the NIGMA Xenodiplomacy Division, was seated 2 rows up and to the left, and she was the only person in the chamber who had read the full human historical file, all 11,000 pages. She had requested it 8 months ago out of professional thoroughness, and she had read it the way you read something that keeps making you stop and go back and read the same line again because you want to be sure you understood it correctly. She had understood it correctly. She watched Mara Voss write on the datapad while the laughter ran its course, and she felt something move through her that she could not name immediately. Something cold and specific, like reaching for a railing in the dark and finding no railing and no wall and nothing at all. She watched Voss's face. Voss was not embarrassed. She was not performing patience or swallowing anger or waiting for the laughter to stop so she could say something sharp. She wrote on the datapad with the quiet focus of someone completing a routine task, the way a person fills an A form they have filled in many times before and already knows every line. Rixtala looked away first. The session closed 2 hours later on a procedural matter that had nothing to do with Kethra. Delegates moved through the corridor doors in easy groups, still talking, the mood settled and good, the kind of mood that follows a session when nothing unexpected happened. Varric Nin received brief words of approval from passing colleagues, his bioluminescence golden and warm, the color of a man who had handled something cleanly. Rixtala moved to the corridor near the main exit. She told herself she was checking her schedule. She was reviewing her notes. She was doing the small tasks that fill the spaces between larger ones. She happened to be near the door when Mara Voss came through it. Voss walked without hurrying. She did not look like a woman who had just been laughed at by 43 species. She looked like a woman who had completed the first item on a list that had many items still remaining. Their eyes met. 2 seconds. No warmth, no hostility, no performance of any kind. Just a clear and measuring look, the kind that takes stock. Then Voss looked forward and walked out into the transit corridor and was gone. Rixtala stood still for a moment. She thought about the datapad. She thought about 11,000 pages of human history, about the extinctions they had almost reached and the recoveries that should not have been survivable, about the specific way humans documented their worst moments, not as catastrophes but as case studies, indexed and cross-referenced, filed under headings that said things like asterisk what we did wrong asterisk and asterisk what we do differently next time asterisk. The chamber behind her was empty now. The laughter had gone with the delegates, carried out in pockets and corridors, already becoming a small story some of them would tell at dinner. Rixtala thought about what Voss had been writing on the datapad. She did not know what it said. She would not know for 90 cycles, but standing in the quiet corridor with the echo of comfortable sounds still fading in the stone above her, she thought with a clarity that felt like cold water that whatever Voss had been writing was not a response to the laughter. It was already past the laughter. It was already somewhere else entirely. Outside, 90 cycles began their count. Only one species in that building had set a clock. 60 cycles into the countdown, the NIGMA Intelligence Division filed a report. It was a low-priority report. That was the first mistake. The report noted unusual human activity in several sectors: fleet repositioning, supply line adjustments. A number of human colony worlds had gone quiet on standard communication channels. Not dark, not silent the way a world goes silent when something has gone wrong. Just quiet, the way a room goes quiet when everyone in it has stopped what they were doing and is waiting for something they cannot yet name. The NIGMA analyst who filed the report noted that human military tonnage represented less than 4% of NIGMA's total fleet weight. He wrote this in the summary section where it would be seen first. He meant it as useful context. It functioned as a sedative. Grand Consul Varric Nin reviewed the report in a morning meeting that had 6 other items on its agenda. He looked at the 4% figure. He moved to the next item. The report was filed. 3 cycles later, the first anomalies appeared. In the Kethra belt, small things. Equipment on 3 NIGMA client-state mining operations began running calibration errors. Ships arrived at coordinates slightly off from where they were supposed to be. Navigation data that had been reliable for years started producing minor inconsistencies. Nothing that stopped work, nothing that caused harm, just small persistent wrongness that required extra time to correct. The operations managers filed complaints with their regional administrators. The regional administrators escalated to NIGMA's Infrastructure Division. The Infrastructure Division sent a team. The team found nothing. Meanwhile, 30 cycles from the deadline, Admiral Chen Wei sat in the command bay of the carrier Unbroken Ground and checked his math for the 14th time. Wei was not a large man and he was not a loud man, and the callsign Tombstone had not been given to him because of anything he had said. It had started at Kepler Station 7 years ago, after an engagement that the official record described in careful neutral language and that the people who had been there described in no language at all, because they did not talk about it. His crew had started calling him Tombstone somewhere in the weeks after Kepler Station, and he had not corrected them, and the name had travelled with him since. He found this funny. That was the part his crew had learned to pay attention to. He checked the math one more time. The numbers had not changed. They would not change. He had been hoping, somewhere in the back of a mind that ran calculations the way other people breathe, that he had made an error somewhere in the early stages. Something small, a multiplier off by a fraction, a variable weighted incorrectly, an error that would change the conclusion. There was no error. He set down his coffee and looked at the star map on the wall of the command bay. The Kethra belt was marked in yellow. The NIGMA positions were marked in red. The corridors between them were marked in the pale grey that his mapping system used for contested space. There was a lot of pale grey. He picked the coffee back up. A junior officer named Sarah Dahl came into the command bay with a status update and found Wei looking at the map. She had served on his crew for 2 years and she had learned to read the quality of his silences the way sailors read weather. This silence was not the comfortable kind. She gave him the status update. He acknowledged it without looking away from the map. She did not leave. "Sir," she said, "what happens if they just don't move? What if the deadline comes and the NIGMA don't pull back from Kethra?" Wei looked at the map for a moment. He looked at her. "Then we find out," he said, "which one of us read the other's history." Harder. He said it the way he said most things, quietly, without extra weight, the way you state a fact about distance or weather. Sarah Dahl wrote it down in her memory and did not ask a follow-up question. She left the command bay and went to the small supply station at the end of the corridor and spent the next several minutes reorganizing the coffee packets and supply containers into neat rows, perfectly aligned. She did it twice. She did not think about why she was doing it until much later, when she was trying to explain the feeling to someone who had not been there, and she said it felt like being handed a structural report on your house that said everything was fine, except the inspector's hands were shaking when he gave it to you. 30 cycles from the deadline, a NIGMA admiral sent a formal inquiry to the Human Conclave office. The inquiry asked, in precise diplomatic language, whether the human delegation wished to clarify or update its position regarding the Kethra matter. Mara Voss replied the same day. The reply was 6 words. *30 cycles remaining. Noted. Voss*. The admiral read it twice. He forwarded it to Varaknin's office with a short note attached that said, *I am not sure what to do with this. Varaknin's office did not reply. Rixtala had been reassigned to monitoring duty since the conclave session. Her job was to track human, diplomatic and commercial activity and flag anything unusual. She had been flagging things for 60 cycles, and her flag log was now longer than the original intelligence report by a significant margin. She had flagged the fleet repositioning. She had flagged the colony quiet. She had flagged 17 separate commercial transactions in which human companies had purchased maintenance and service contracts on NIGMA-adjacent infrastructure at prices that were fair, even generous, with no obvious immediate benefit to the buyers. Each flag had been received. None had been escalated. She sat at her desk on the night of the 61st cycle and looked at her flag log, then looked at the wall. Above her desk for a long time, she thought about 11,000 pages. She thought about the chapter she had reread 3 times, the one about the period humans called the Long Preparation, a 200-year stretch in their history when they had been building something in plain sight and nobody looking at them had understood what they were building until it was finished. She opened a new document. She typed a request for an urgent escalation review. She looked at it. She sent it. Then she sat back and looked at the ceiling and thought, with a heaviness that had nothing to do with the hour, that she had just done the right thing 30 cycles too late. Outside the window, the station. Light cycled toward night and the Kethra belt was still there, unchanged and yellow on every map, and the clock that only one species was watching kept counting down toward the number that meant the window was going to close. Nobody on the NIGMA side had opened a window. They had not understood there was one. That was the second mistake, and it was the one that cost them everything that came after. The transmission went out at the first hour of cycle 90. Not a declaration, not a speech, 4 words and a timestamp, sent from the human diplomatic station to the NIGMA High Council's secure frequency. *, the window is closed. *. Mara Voss had written it herself. She sent it from the same desk where she had written her notes during the conclave session, in the same building, with the same cup of cold tea sitting to her left that she always forgot to drink while it was warm. She sent it and sat back and looked at the wall. There was nothing more for her to do on her end. There was a great deal about to happen on every other end. 22 minutes after the transmission, 6 NIGMA client-state mining operations in the Kethra belt went offline. Not destroyed, offline. Power systems shut down cleanly, the way a light goes out when someone flips a switch. No explosion, no wreckage, no signal of distress, just equipment that had been running continuously for years, stopping. All at once, the silence on the monitoring screens was the silence of absence, not damage, and it was somehow worse for being so clean. Operations managers sent emergency signals. The signals went unanswered. Teams on the ground checked their equipment, checked their power connections, checked their relay links. Everything looked intact. The systems had simply decided to stop, the way a door decides to stay shut when it has been locked from the other side. 3 hours after the mining operations went dark, NIGMA's primary logistics hub at Shear 9 sent an emergency alert to the High Council. The transit gate at Shear 9 had been locked. This required some explanation, because the transit gate at Shear 9 was not supposed to be lockable. NIGMA engineers had built it over 60 years with one central design principle. The gate had no locking mechanism because a gate that could be locked against you, and the NIGMA Empire did not build things that could be turned against them. This had been considered, designed around, solved, and written into the official build record as a feature. The lock that now held the gate shut had been installed 9 years ago. It had arrived inside a routine firmware update, bundled with 17 other minor system improvements, written by a 26-year-old human infrastructure engineer named Kofi Answer who had died of cardiac failure 8 years later and who had never seen the gate he had locked. The code was clean, efficient. It had passed every NIGMA security review because it had not looked like a lock. It had looked like a calibration feature. It was a lock. And it was locked. The NIGMA High Council convened within the hour. Varaknin stood at the head of the council table, and for the first time in his 3-century political career he did not have an opening statement. He stood. He looked at the situation reports on the display wall. He looked at the faces of his council. He said nothing. One of his ministers began a damage assessment. Another began an analysis of military response options. A third was already drafting a formal protest to the conclave, the room filled with the sound of competent people doing the things they knew how to do, which is what people do when the thing in front of them is too large to face directly. Varric Nin sat down. He looked at his hands. He said, quietly, to no one in particular, "Pull up the original transmission, the address from the conclave session." The room paused. Someone pulled it up. Mara Voss appeared on the display wall, 12 minutes old and standing at the podium of the chamber that had laughed at her. Her voice came through measured and clear, laying facts down in plain language, naming numbers, citing sources. The council listened in. A silence that was very different from the comfortable silence of the session itself. This silence had weight. Varric Nin stopped the playback at the 2-minute mark. He played 30 seconds again. He played it a third time. "She was not warning us," he said. His counsel waited. "She was telling us what was going to happen," he said. "Because she already knew. She was giving us time to make a different choice before the choice was made for us." His bioluminescence had shifted to the pale grey-white of NIGMA grief. It was a colour his counsel had rarely seen on him. He had been in politics for 300 years and he had worn that colour so seldom that seeing it on him now felt wrong. The way a tool looks wrong when it is being used for the first time after years of sitting unused. The withdrawal demand was not a negotiating position, he said. It was a door she was holding open. Nobody spoke. The display wall still showed Mara Voss at the podium, paused mid-sentence, her hand resting on her datapad. Rixtala received the news in her monitoring station 2 floors below the council chamber. She had been awake since before the transmission went out, sitting at her desk with her flag log open, watching the mining operation feeds go dark one by one in a sequence so clean and precise it looked like someone reading from a list. She did not feel satisfied. She had flagged this, she had escalated, she had done everything the job required. The outcome was the same. She thought about the human historical file. She thought about a passage in the chapter on their third major interstellar conflict, a passage that described human strategic doctrine with a simplicity that had made her stop and reread it. Asterisk, they do not wait to become strong enough. They become strong enough first, and then they wait. Asterisk. She thought about 9 years of patience, about firmware updates, about a man who died before he ever needed to know if the door he had built would hold. She opened a communication channel to the council chamber. She did not wait to be called. "I am requesting permission to file a diplomatic contact request with the human delegation," she said. There was a pause on the other end. Then Varric Nin's voice, worn thin at the edges in a way she had never heard before. "File it." She filed it. The reply came back in 4 hours, which Rixtala would later learn was, by human diplomatic standard, the equivalent of running to the door, 1 word. Asterisk noted. Asterisk. She stared at that word for a long time. She thought about Mara Voss in the conclave corridor, the 2-second look, the complete absence of performance. She thought about what it meant that a species used that word the same way for catastrophic news and for routine acknowledgement and for the beginnings of things. She pulled up the human historical file. She opened to the chapter she had not yet finished. She started reading. 2 floors up, in the council chamber, the display wall still held Mara Voss frozen at the podium with her hand on her datapad and the chamber laughing behind her, and Varric Nin sat in front of it in the colour of grief and did not ask anyone to turn it off. He kept watching. He was trying to see what he had missed. He was beginning to understand that what he had missed was not in the address. It was in the 12 seconds of silence before the address began, the silence of a woman who had already looked at the room and made her accounting and was now fulfilling a necessary obligation before moving on to what came next. The next thing was already in motion. It had been in motion for 11 years. The negotiations began on the 4th day after the deadline. NIGMA had requested them. That was notable. In 400 years of conclave membership, the NIGMA Empire had requested formal negotiations with another species exactly 3 times, and twice those requests had been strategic, a way of buying time while repositioning for something else. This time there was nothing to reposition for. Mara Voss knew it, so did Varric Nin, which made the request the most honest document his office had produced in some years. The preliminary meeting was held in a neutral chamber on the conclave station's 3rd tier. Voss came with 2 staff members. The NIGMA delegation came with 11, which told Voss several things about how they were reading the situation, none of them surprising. A junior attaché on the NIGMA side, a young official named Taransol, had been assigned to handle the pre-call briefing. He had prepared extensively. He had a document listing 17 potential human demands, ranked by likelihood, with counteroffer frameworks built for each scenario. He had worked on it for 3 days and it was careful, Thorough work. Voss sat down across from him. Ambassador Voss, he said, with the careful formality of someone who has rehearsed. Before we begin, may I ask directly, what does the human delegation want from this process? Voss looked at him. Kethra withdrawal, she said. Reparations to the 3 destabilized civilizations, and for this not to need to happen again.
Taransol wetted.
That's it, Voss said. He looked at his 17-point document. He looked back at her. His hands, resting flat on the table, were very still in the specific way that hands go still when the person they belong to is working hard to keep them from moving. That's it, Voss said again, and it was not an emphasis, just a clarity. Taransol excused himself from the room for 4 minutes. When he came back his document was closed. He did not open it again for the rest of the day. The harder part of the negotiation was not the demands. The harder part was the accounting. NIGMA's legal and economic division spent the first week of talks trying to determine exactly how embedded human commercial presence was in NIGMA-adjacent infrastructure, and the number they came back with was not a comfortable one. Human companies held active service contracts on 43 separate systems that NIGMA depended on for daily logistics. They held maintenance agreements on 11 transit relay stations. They had built, at competitive cost and on schedule, 6 of the 14 atmospheric processes on NIGMA's third colony world. None of it had been hidden. Every contract was in the public record. Every bid had gone through normal channels. The prices had been fair and the work had been good, and nobody had questioned any of it because there had been nothing to question. The NIGMA economy minister stared at the accounting summary for a long time. This is not espionage, she said finally. No, said her aide. They just participated. Yes. In everything. Thoroughly, said the aide, and then stopped talking because there was nothing useful to add to that. Removing the human presence from NIGMA infrastructure would cost more than the Kethra withdrawal. It would take longer. It would leave gaps that had no immediate replacement. The minister filed this in her report under a heading that said *compounding vulnerability* and sent it to the council without editorial comment because the editorial comment was obvious. Rixtala attended every session of the preliminary talks as part of the NIGMA support delegation. She did not speak in most sessions. Her job was to observe and record and provide context when context was needed. She was good at the job. In the third session, Mara Voss arrived 4 minutes late and set her datapad on the table and looked across at the NIGMA delegation and said, without preamble, the 3 civilizations in Kethra, I want their names in the reparations document, not affected populations, their names. There was a brief discussion on the NIGMA side about the precedent this might set. It sets the precedent that they have names, Voss said. The discussion ended. Rixtala wrote this down in her notes. She wrote it in her personal log that night in a section she kept for herself. She wrote, she is not doing this to win. She is doing this because she believes it is correct. Those are different motivations and they produce different kinds of people across the table, and I do not think we understood the difference before today. On the 6th day, Rixtala requested a brief informal meeting with Voss outside the session schedule. Voss agreed. They met in a small room off the main corridor. No delegation, no recorders. Rixtala had prepared what she wanted to say. I voted against dismissal, she said. In the original review after your conclave address, I filed flags. I requested escalation. I want you to know that. Voss was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. Rixtala had not expected that. You know. We track votes, Voss said, and we read flag logs when they're available. You were the only vote against dismissal. Your flags were detailed and accurate. Rixtala considered this. Does it change anything? Voss looked at her. Not the 2-second inventory look from the conclave corridor, a longer look, more direct, with something in it that was the closest thing to warmth Voss's face generally allowed. It changes what the next conversation looks like, Voss said. The one after this one. When we are building something instead of dismantling something, those conversations go better when both sides have people in the room who read carefully. Rixtala thought about the 11,000-page file. She thought about the flag request she had sent 63 cycles ago, too late but sent anyway. I'll keep reading, she said. Voss nodded once. She picked up her datapad. She stood. Good, she said, and left. On the 12th day, Admiral Chen Wei stood down his fleet from active positioning. He did it quietly, without announcement. The order went out on standard channels and the ships moved back to their assigned corridors and the pale grey spaces on the Kethra map began to clear. Wei sat in the command bay and drank his coffee and looked at the map. Sarah Dahl came in with a status report and found him with the look of a man who had just set down something very heavy rather than the look of a man who had won something. She left the status report on the console. She went back to the corridor. She did not stop at the supply station this time. She did not need to reorganize anything. The feeling that had made her hands want to move things into rows had been replaced by something quieter and heavier, something that did not need her hands at all. She stood in the corridor for a moment. She thought about the question she had asked Wei 30 cycles ago, standing in that same command bay, and she thought about his answer, the calm and specific weight of it, the way he had looked at the map before he looked at her. Asterisk, then we find out which one of us read the other's history harder. Asterisk. She thought about what it meant that he had not looked worried when he said it. She went back to work. The formal settlement was signed on the 41st day. It was not a long document for something that had reshaped the political geography of 3 sectors. 14 pages, clear language. The NIGMA Empire would withdraw from the Kethra Belt in stages over the following 20 cycles. Reparations to the 3 named civilizations would be structured across 40 cycles and administered through a joint oversight body. The Shear 9 transit gate would be unlocked within 72 hours of signing. Human commercial contracts in NIGMA infrastructure would continue under their existing terms. That last item had generated 3 days of argument on the NIGMA side before Varric Nin ended it by saying, very quietly, if we void legitimate contracts with a party that has just shown us what they do with patience, we deserve whatever follows. The argument ended. At the conclave formal session 2 cycles after the signing, Varric Nin delivered an address. It ran 29 minutes. He had written it himself, which was unusual. His addresses were normally prepared by a team of 6 people who understood how to fill time with the right kind of sound. This one was quieter than his addresses usually were, and harder to sit in. He acknowledged the Kethra correction by name, humanity's name for it. He used it without quotation marks, without the slight verbal distance that speakers use when they say a word they have not fully decided to own. He said it straight. He spoke about the gap between 400 years of institutional history and 11 years of a species whose complete record should have been read and was not. He did not assign blame to specific people or specific decisions. He distributed it evenly across a way of seeing the world that was comfortable and therefore dangerous. Near the end he said, we heard the warning as ambition, we heard the deadline as theatre, we heard a door being held open and we called it an obstacle. The error was not political, it was a failure of imagination. We could not picture, with the necessary precision, what we were dealing with. That is an error we carry forward, because we have earned it. In seat 41, Mara Voss wrote on her data pad. The chamber was quiet this time. Not the comfortable quiet of a session when nothing unexpected has happened. The other kind, the kind that has weight. After the session, in the main corridor near the transit exit, Rixtala fell into step beside Voss. They walked in silence for a moment. You knew, Rixtala said. At the first session, when you wrote on the pad while the chamber laughed, you already knew how it was going to end. Voss was quiet for a step or 2. I knew how it could end, she said. Is there a difference? Voss considered this the way she considered everything, with the kind of full attention that most people saved for problems rather than questions. We spent 400 years hoping there was, she said. We stopped hoping around year 200. It was a bad 200 years. Rixtala thought about that. She thought about the files, about the chapter called The Long Preparation, about the cross-reference lessons filed under headings that said asterisk what we do differently next time asterisk. What were you writing, she said, in the session, while they laughed? The vote, Voss said. Who laughed and who didn't, who was in the room and where they were sitting. For the reparations list. For the next conversation, Voss said, the one after the correction, the one where something gets built instead of dismantled, it matters who was paying attention. They had reached the door. Voss stopped. She looked at Rixtala with the full version of the look, the one that held more in it than the simple inventory. You're going to be good at what comes next, she said, if you stay in this work. It was not a compliment exactly. It was more like a reading, an assessment from someone whose assessments had a track record. Rixtala said, noted. She said it quietly, the way something comes out before you decide to say it, and for a half second she was not sure if it was the right word or the wrong one. Voss smiled, not large, not warm in any way that could be photographed, but real, the kind that lives only in the corners of a face and means more for being small. She walked out. Rixtala stood at the door for a moment after Voss disappeared into the corridor beyond. She thought about 11,000 pages. She thought about the flags she had sent and the ones that had not been read and the one that had arrived 30 cycles too late to change the outcome but early enough to change something else, something smaller and more lasting. She thought about the next conversation, the one where something gets built. She went back to her office and opened the human historical file and found her page. She kept reading. That night, in his private office high in the Conclave Tower, Grand Consul Varric Nin sent a request to the Conclave Archive. He requested the full human historical file, not the summary, not the analytical digest prepared for senior officials, the full text, all 11,000 pages, from page 1. The file arrived in 20 minutes. He opened it. The language was plain. Humans wrote their own history in plain language, he noticed immediately. They did not dress it in the formal constructions that older species used to put distance between the record and the reader. They wrote as if they intended the reader to feel the weight of each event directly, without any cushion between the words and the person reading them. He read about the early wars, the ones fought on a single world before the species knew there were other worlds within reach. He read about the near extinctions, some caused by nature and some caused by themselves, by choices made with too little information or too much fear. He read about the recoveries, slow and difficult and documented with a thoroughness that could only come from a species deeply committed to not repeating the same loss twice. He read for 4 hours. The office lights cycled through their nighttime sequence and came back up to morning levels, and he was still reading. He had covered 60 pages. He set the file on rest and looked at the window and the early light moving through it. Asterisk 60 pages, asterisk he thought. Asterisk, and they were already warning each other. Asterisk. Not warning enemies, warning themselves. They had been writing instructions to their future selves before they had the vocabulary to describe clearly what they were warning against. Building the habit of foresight the only way any species builds anything that holds, through repetition, through loss, through the decision to write it down and put it somewhere the next version of themselves would find it. He thought about Mara Voss at the podium. 12 minutes, plain language, every number named. He thought about the 12 seconds of silence before the address began. He thought about a 26-year-old engineer who had locked a door and died before he ever needed to know if it held. He thought about a species that had stood at the edge of its own extinction enough times that it had stopped being afraid of the edge and started being afraid of the walk that led to it, and so had developed the habit of watching the path instead of the drop, and of writing down every stone that had made them stumble. He picked up the file. He found his page. He kept reading. Outside the window, the station moved through its slow orbit and the Kethra belt sat quiet in the distance, the yellow marker on every map already beginning to clear as the first NIGMA withdrawal teams moved into position. And in the back row of the now empty conclave chamber, seat 41 sat in the dark. It had always been a small seat. It had always been in the back. It had never needed to be anything else.